with us on 226 and some outstanding questions on H159. But let's start with Tom. Tom, we're close to voting this bill out, and the issue came up about whether the cap was appropriate or not, and that led to other issues being raised. I don't know, were you listening in to any of the testimony this morning, Tom?
No, I wasn't able to. I was on another Zoom call.
Okay. So one of the issues that I think exists is whether the program, we're talking about the VITA program now, is the current ERG program has changed from its original purpose of trying to sustain businesses that are in trouble versus looking back and taking care of past losses, I guess. And let's start with that. I'd like to hear your general thoughts, but if maybe you could address that question first.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you're at with things in general, but let me just start by prefacing with an initial reaction to a lot of the language in this bill and related ones describe conditions that were relevant a year ago or even 2 years ago, but most of it is kind of year ago sort of thing. And the world has changed really quickly, and the economy has changed pretty dramatically over that period. So, there are clearly firms that have been pandemic impacted and are still pandemic impacted, but the economy is at a pretty high boil, and the businesses that I'm talking to have more of a problem with meeting demand, hiring workers, dealing with inflationary pressures, the like, than having not enough demand and pandemic-related loss. So I think you have a difficult task staying abreast of all of that and then tailoring programs to be as impactful as possible. As you know, these programs in the past have suffered from problems with equity, problems with efficiency and waste. A lot of money has gone out to places that it wasn't needed, and that's always suboptimal. It's taxpayer money, and you want it to have the most impact you can, and you want to be focused where it can be. I think the VITA short-term loan, forgivable loans, is a good place to put money designed to assist people that are still heavily impacted, and there are some, but lots and lots of businesses have adapted and adjusted. We're seeing levels of Meals and Rooms receipts that are considerably higher than pre-pandemic. That sector has really bounced back, but it's a different sector. There's been a lot of adaptation that's been required, and trends that were present before the pandemic, like a shift towards more short-term lodging rentals, online rentals like Airbnb, have been accelerated and haven't really dropped back a whole lot. So that sort of thing is now more a feature of that sector. Happily, we're getting revenues from that as well. But you may have impacted firms that are not going to come back because of that change in consumer preference. So I don't envy your task in terms of allocating monies that have whole lots of strings associated with them, with the federal programs and I know Joan's been struggling with changing rules and the like with existing programs, and that's a tough thing to try to deal with. But essentially, the amount of money that you allocate to any of these things is based on political priorities. It's your job to consider what the most pressing priorities of the state and to allocate the monies accordingly, and then to try to do it in a way as efficient as possible. So in this case, spending as little as possible to achieve the results that you want is the best thing for the taxpayer and best thing for the economy. And I think with the VITA program, again, if it could be only lending, that would be better than grants. But I realize there's a timetable to getting money out. So grants can certainly be a part of it.
Tom,
I'm sorry.
No, you don't. Sorry, this is the awkward thing about you being where you are and us being here. It's all loans. There are no grants with the short-term forgivable loan program.
A forgivable loan is essentially a grant.
Oh, right. I guess I just still think of it as yes, of course. Thank you. I mean, it's still, we'll call it. And some will be very short-term because our understanding with Cassie is that if everything is there, it will function very quickly. Hopefully, which is we are hoping to get money out the door fast for people. So, yeah, sorry. It's still for me a loan because it's not right. But of course, if they meet all the conditions, it is forgivable and then will become a grant.
Yeah, the fact that you've got some conditions that have to be met are good for this, so that you're seeing where it's going. Again, depending on how what the assessment is, it can essentially though be additional profit to a business owner, and that's sometimes the struggle that exists with this, like with the CIP monies, that they in large part are sort of icing on the cake for projects. There's demand for a project, there's a need for it. There may not have been any COVID loss per se, and it can help a project go forward, but that's drops right to the bottom line of the project, and so the project owner ends up with those public funds as profit. So that's just that's kind of the nature of what it is, but it's to the extent you can really focus it where there's need, that's great. At the same time, you want to be flexible because for any set of rules you write, there are always going to be somebody that falls through the net and other people that are undeserving that somehow can finagle the numbers and qualify. So a process like VITA would look at a loan is a good one. You look at the whole financial sweep of a company, you try to figure out where they're at. If these losses are really related to the pandemic, or if there's just been poor business management for a number of years, and you have to make judgment calls on that. And VITA's having to do that for a loan process anyway, so that's kind of scrutiny that's involved. It's not always super quick. That's part of if you want it to be more targeted, you've got to get more information and you've got to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. You can't just be automatically sending it out.
So I have a question on that because if we the way the bill is drafted right now, there's a lot of flexibility to VITA, but VITA has shared with us how they're going to fill in some of those holes. In terms of, one of the big issues for me is that, do we want to do this to scale? So we've got big businesses, they should get higher amounts of awards at the cap at 150,000 or 250,000 or whatever limits that. On the other hand, Cassie has told us that she's gonna not consider any business that hasn't had at least 25% loss in income, essentially, over a 2-year period. And in my mind, that translates into, on average, 12.5% loss for each year. And then you're in the door to get a grant, depending upon how much your net operating loss has gone down. And we just heard from a business that lost a lot of money in the first year, sort of broke even in the second year, is turning a profit this year. But they still could make the case that over those 2-year period, they lost 25%. And I'm struggling with knowing whether we want to give more money to people raising the cap that are truly struggling. But how do we define truly struggling now?
Yeah, that's a tough call because, is it the role of state government or the federal government to ensure profitability no matter what happens in the world? That right now you could say if you're struggling and hiring people, that's a pandemic effect, and you ought to get money so that you can pay them more so that you can hire people. Your profitability would be higher if you had more people working, you could produce more product. Where does it end? So I think that it needs to be viewed as sort of a stopgap. Nobody's going to be made completely whole, except for those that didn't need it in the first place or needed very little and could qualify easily with things like PPP that had almost no hurdle whatsoever. But if a company is still in business, they may have had a rough patch, but they've managed or adapted and they're still in business. I don't know that it's a good use of taxpayer money to necessarily be just, doling out additional monies. Now, if they've had to borrow so much that they're really burdened going forward with the interest payments and it may threaten the viability of the business, maybe pay down those loans or pay the interest on those loans and have that be the expenditure. But I think it should be the goal of the entity that's providing the support to do it as efficiently as possible. That is to spend the smallest amount of taxpayer money to accomplish the goal of keeping those businesses viable. There's been a tremendous amount of new company startups, even in sectors that are depressed. There have been a lot of restaurant startups. There have been a lot of, nationally, huge number of new business startups. And that speaks to the way the economy responds to these sorts of things. And the longer it goes, people get creative and figure out ways to, where they can make money and how they can do it. So I would be reluctant to go back and just say, just because somebody meets some formulaic criteria, that it's a good idea to necessarily be making everyone whole who had some hit during the pandemic.
Thanks, Tom. We can't possibly, as you already said, make everyone whole. That's just not a possibility. And I think we have to vote this bill out if we can today. I mean, we are really up against, I think we can't be going back to try and figure out who's struggling and who isn't. That's the job of VITA. And that's why I feel very comfortable giving this review to VITA. We've given them guardrails. ARPA has given VITA guardrails. I am set to go with VITA. This is our last big piece of recovery money. They're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops to get money and prove that they are still in real need. So I think we cannot be now thinking about who's struggling and who isn't. That's their job. They will figure it out. And I feel very confident that VITA has the tools between the ARPA ruling and our work on this bill to go forward and make wise choices.
Yeah, so I think the best thing that you can do if you've decided that is to make it as transparent as possible. I think that does two things. I do think it gives the public the confidence that, in fact, public money that's being gifted to companies owned by some of the wealthier people in society. That's just by definition how it works, is that there should be real clarity about who got the money and why, so that they're not, that reduces the game playing with the accounting that, yeah, we can show a loss there, or we can show this 3-month loss, but maybe we're a seasonal business and there's something unique about that. I mean, all those cards are on the table. It also, for VITA or anybody administering it, they know that there'll be, somebody coming back, and it's possible to look at the decisions that were made, and they will also make them with greater scrutiny. I mean, you really do have, in a small state where, people know each other, it's easy to have some overlap between a business person who, fits a criteria for some application and somebody granting a lot of money for that. So transparency, I've just maximized that, whether it's an agent of the legislature. Obviously the auditor, I think, probably has access anyway to it, but that would be an important part of it.
Yeah, we agree, I think.
So just, I mean, you're an economist and you follow this stuff, but are there lessons to be learned with this program started out as a recovery program, and all the other ones were recovery programs. Now it's sort of looking back and trying to heal wounds in a lot of ways. What is the experience in the literature and everything in terms of how the state has done and how the federal government has done with these programs? I mean, I heard that we have given out $3 billion in the state of Vermont to businesses, and that we, as our priority in terms of the ARPA discretionary money, we favored businesses compared to the rest of the country may have favored childcare or something like that. Can you just talk generally what's going on? So,
I mean,
Yeah, but before,
can you ask the question?
I mean, that's the total spend on people too.
I'm sorry, Allison, I didn't catch the last part.
No, I was just saying, we spent 3.56 billion, but that is on everything from our UI additions to our businesses to our childcare. That's the whole gamut of what we spend on of CARES and ARPA money on the people and businesses of Vermont.
That's what I heard Doug Hopper testified.
That's the total spending.
That's the total spending for business only from federal and state.
Okay, we have to clarify that, because my understanding is that it's total period. Okay.
Okay, well, essentially though, where you choose to spend money reflects your political priorities, where, and that you're balancing those every day. Obviously some segments of society come into the legislature with louder voices, and you're going to hear from them more, and that's a tough job, and that is essentially the political process, but that should reflect your priorities. There are lots of things you can do with this money besides this, and if you're comfortable with how that's allocated, that is the political process. It is true that in prior programs like this, there's been money that's been dispersed that didn't need to be. It's the same is true with some of the other aspects of the money that went out. You mentioned childcare. Michael, one of the most effective federal programs was assistance to families with children, and that actually lowered the poverty rate noticeably in an extremely short period of time. They're powerful tools because there's a lot of money, and where you put that money will have impact. If it's truly a struggling business, you keep going, that's one thing. if it's adding to the profitability of a project that would happen anyway, you are essentially transferring money from the public to the top, certainly 10%, but probably a lot of it is in the top 1%, exacerbating inequality that has already, arguably, from everything we've seen through the pandemic, been worsened just by virtue of the way the economy's worked through the pandemic.
Can we move to the capital investment grants for a second? You've heard some of the testimony and you've seen latest versions of it, and you know you've been intimately involved with the first round of $10 million going out. My understanding, we've seen a list of projects that I think there are 38 projects that are poised to get funded. One question I have, and Joan's here as well, I think she said yesterday that the requested amount of these grants, the applicants, were not for the full amount of the project, in part because there was a 50% limitation that could be funded. Does that mean, I actually will ask Joan this question if you don't mind for a second. Does that mean that most of the applicants put in for 50% of the project cost, or did some put in for 10% of the project cost? I know it was reduced because of return on investment, but what did they ask for?
Hi, Joan Goldstein, Commissioner, Department of Economic Development. It's all across the board. Some people are asking for 10%. Some people are asking for 50, others that asked for more. We had to stop in the process and say you need at least match for the amount that you're asking for. So it's a variety. I mean, Tom could also attest to that as he's calculating proportionality.
Yeah, for the most part, the requests came in at 50% of the total project cost, except for those projects that were more than $3 million, because the initial cap was $1.5 million. And so they'd only then ask for $1.5 million, even if the project was $20 million, because that was the maximum amount. So that's typically what we saw. There might have been one or two exceptions, but those were people that probably didn't understand exactly what the rules were, but otherwise they were asking for as much, and that's reasonable to think that they would ask for as much as possible. Then later, and Joan, you can speak to this, the $1.5 million, due to some rules with the federal government, turns out that more like $1 million was sort of an effective limit, and so then that brought it down to $999,999, and so that's kind of where it sits now. But then the net fiscal impact is a higher bar. There are a few that have qualified for many multiples of the net fiscal impact, but for the most part, it's reduced the amount because these are in large part non-exporting entities that involve some in-state competition and the like, and you just don't get as much kick out of net fiscal impact as you would for, say, the typical VEPSI applicant.
Well, okay, so we've moved away from net fiscal impact. We've heard the case there. But are there other changes in this program that you would give us some warning or guidance that we should preserve, or that we're letting go of at this point? I understand that, for instance, all of these applicants could come in and ask for more money than what they're about to get under the old rules. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on, we like the capital improvement, but again, we want to tie to recovery, and one of the things of net fiscal impact was it was bringing something back to the economy of the state. Now, if that's not there, what guidance do we want to preserve?
Well, I think the most difficult part has to do with which of these projects would happen in the absence of any public money. And that's a really difficult thing to discern. But, you know, projects that are well underway, projects that are well funded, projects owned by investors and individuals with access to capital, you know, are probably not, you know, the most, doesn't represent the most pressing need in society. But the other aspect, you know, this was designed to be transformational. That word was used, and, you know, I mean, I know there's sort of been a shift to understanding this as lowercase t, but, you know, we're getting down to font sizes that are 0.001 of a t to describe what, you know, some of these projects would do in terms of economic impacts. I think if you want a program that basically just disperses money to a lot of things that people think are generally good projects, things that they would like to see happen and, you know, need some help, you can make it really loose like that, and the money can flow out in an instant. There are plenty of people lined up. And more and more are getting used to and expectant of public money to do most anything. And then there's a whole, you know, sub-industry of accountants and the like who will be identifying public monies that are available and assisting people with applications and that kind of thing. I'm not sure that's what you want or if that's beneficial, but I think the difficult thing is really finding projects where the state money really makes the difference in it happening or not happening. You know, where is public money best allocated to improve economic development, to set the stage for growth. And I'm not sure picking winners and losers at an individual company level is something state government's really set up to do very well.
So just you said earlier that in the VITA program, and I'm not sure this is accurate, there is the ability of VITA to screen based upon need and sustainability of the company. Okay, they do the loans and they do it individually. In your experience, is the same thing happening with this program right now? Is there any of that but for, or looking at what other access to capital or how far the program is, and we're just going to, you know, substitute the state taxpayer dollars for a project that could have been funded and gone for on its own? Is there any of that in the program as currently structured?
Yes, that's something that in order to run a net fiscal impact analysis, it has to clear the bar of, you know, what would happen in the absence of the money, because otherwise it's not essential, and you would never even run the model. And that's why with Veggie, that's kind of the first bar, the first question that gets asked. And you know, it's not like you can prove it without a doubt, but there are things that there's economic information and financial information that can give you a sense of the reasonableness of that assumption. And so we try to flag that for Joan and the people downstream to say, you know, if you're doing it proportional to the capital stock, here's the kind of range you'd be looking at. There are some instances, though, where it's so obvious, you know, that it's a negligible part of it, that, you know, we would say it's not, you know, it wouldn't be reasonable to go beyond a certain level. But for the most part, you know, that does take time, and everybody expects to get their money right away. You know, there's already complaining, you know, it's too low and it's too slow and all that kind of thing. But that's the trade-off to being more targeted and having more scrutiny. And when it's a grant, it's different than if it's a loan or a tax credit or things like that. It's it's real money right into people's pockets. Look at the hoops people have to jump through to get food stamps and things like that. I think if somebody's really looking for a handout, there ought to be some scrutiny applied to that, and that should be part of the process to protect the taxpayer.
I'll get you one second, question. So, I mean, I shared in the concern of return on investment because there are softer things that are important to society that don't necessarily translate into economic growth or things like that, that makes the town a better place or whatever. But are we getting rid of in the new version because you're being cut out of the process and there's no return on investment? Instead of tweaking or changing return on investment to include other things, are we now just getting rid of that altogether so that the example that you brought up and that we talked about where they have other sources of money to do this project anyhow is sort of getting lost in this review process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I necessarily have the very latest version of it, but I think there was still something methodologically that was to be done with the Joint Fiscal Committee and maybe the Joint Fiscal Office that would relate to how the award process works. So that's a little bit of kicking the can down the road, but I think it'd be useful if if there was a legislative entity, your committee or some assemblage of legislators, or maybe joint fiscal, where we could, present a few different approaches and say, well, here's how it would have worked if we had just done this, or if you just have a flat adder for certain things that are externalities that you're wanting to support something for not a strictly measurable economic reason. You feel like for a policy reason, you want to affect the supply side of a particular issue, like say childcare. I think it's worth looking at that in a broad sense and saying, what are the various policy options and where can we spend money most effectively? But if you think it is just a supply side issue and you just want to have more childcare no matter what, then maybe a fixed number like a percentage of a project that's just an automatic adder to anything else that's done would be a way to quantify that and apply some value to that, or some scalable range on it. But I think, there'd need to be a lot of details fleshed out about how that might work. We didn't know what applications were going to come in or what the kinds of applicants would be when this was devised a year or so ago. And as they started to come in, first they were sort of clumped in one area, and we had no idea how many would come in either. So the number of applicants has been higher, and the diversity of them has been greater, which has made the analytic part of it slower. But now that they're sort of in categories that have been more deeply analyzed, there could be other ways that we fashion something that would work, still be fair, and protect taxpayer money.
So, Senator Clarkson, and then I'll go to Commissioner Goldstein.
So this is the 11th hour. We are supposed to have had this bill out a week and a half ago, Tom. If I would appreciate it those a while ago, but I think we have guardrails built in with ARPA, and I believe Joan will probably say that again. It is very clear how this money can be spent, and it is pretty clear what our objectives are with this money. This is recovery money. It has to be recovery money, and it has to be going forward. I mean, our hope with this capital investment program is that this moves us forward, as opposed to the VITA forgivable loans, which are really hopefully taking care of the last piece of recovery and relief money. So I think it's unfair to characterize people just wanting to find more free money. There isn't. I have a project in Springfield. There isn't enough money, and it's a tough thing for private investment. And it would be great if we could funnel a ton more public money into it because it will be transformational with a capital T. But it's sadly not going to be eligible under most of these ARPA guidelines. So I think it's a little unfair to talk about the motives behind people who are applying for this program. I think it will have the scrutiny. We now have the Treasury rule in place. I think we're going to have, that's going to be a pretty tough hurdle for them to comply with. And I have, I think that we've worked out a lot of the kinks with this. And I really think we need to float here. We need to try and vote this bill out this morning. So I don't think we can revisit some of the criteria at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting you revisit criteria. I'm saying there is some in the legislation as it's written. There is some further process for reviewing the rules, as I understand it. That joint fiscal would be involved in that. So that hopefully is provides some guarantees that, I think the issue though, you will hear from constituents great ideas, great things that should happen. And in a free market, the way economic ideas are vetted is through a capital financing process that is at the heart of capitalism. And people that are risking their capital give these projects a lot of scrutiny. And those that look like winners and ones that people can sell, get funded, and ones that don't get funded. And I'm just saying that state government doesn't have a very good track record or very much experience stepping into capital markets and is essentially being a venture capitalist with no equity position whatsoever in the investment. So, if you want state government to be a major player in developing some new technology from a company that has a great idea, fine, but give the taxpayers an equity position as well. This money's different, and I realize that it's got to get out the door. The question is really how much you allocate where, and as I said, that's a reflection of political priorities. It's not an economic question. So I don't envy you in having to do that, and that's kind of. I realize also you have to do it sometimes in extremely short periods of time.
Commissioner Goldstein.
Sure. I think Senator Clarkson pretty much summarized what I was going to say, but I just want to be clear that under the current, the way the language reads currently, I think, as economist Kaved has said, that, joint fiscal will have a role. What I do hope, and I think is fair, is that we don't look at this is an economic incentive program. It is an economic recovery program with very stringent guidelines from ARPA and US Treasury, meaning that these people had suffered harm from COVID, and the only people we'll be able to fund were people that will actually be able to provide evidence. The idea that they are leveraging many sources of funds should not be used against them. So for example, if state fiscal recovery represents 10% of their project, it doesn't mean that they're just going to go do it anyway. It means exactly what we want to happen, which is to leverage private markets and other markets to get the project done. So I really appreciate the work that the committee has done. We are still midway with the first round. It is very complex. We are going out to get additional documentation from every single applicant because of the ARPA rule. So I just want to say that, and it's not that we're going to be careless in any way, shape, or form. Most of these people are in impacted industries or are serving impacted households or communities.
Yeah, those priorities are.
Senator Rob.
So I think we should call it to question, personally. And from what I've heard, and businesses that have had greater loss that we're not going to be able to meet, we're not going to be able to, in my mind, for the second threshold of this, if you have this much gross receipts or, you're this much larger of a business, hiring this many more people, we're not gonna be able to have time to do that. But my proposal is we say up to 300K and no time limit on losses.
We haven't talked about that.
Well, I'm not prepared to vote this bill out today.
Okay.
And I'm willing to continue to talk. We need some changes that have to be made
Right.
in from the joint fiscal office, from Pat's testimony. So I think there'll be further discussions, but I understand your position. I don't quite understand your position on no limitation on losses.
I think we could do 6 months if that's the sort of compromise position. I just don't see 3 months as a meaningful band around losses right now.
So you're saying one of the caps is that whatever losses they have in a 2-year period, that should be the cap?
I would go for 6 months or a particular year. I just don't think that 3 months is.
Well, I would be interested in going to a particular year, because if they've made a recovery, then that's, I'm more concerned about where they are now, to stay true to the purpose of this program. But I'm gonna call a halt to this right now, unless, plus you have
Yeah, no,
further comments, because I want to hear from David.
yeah, I do too. But Cassie has talked about it being 2021. I mean, we know the period. I would support not using the date of January 2020, if that's what we're talking about, but I think.
No, that's a different issue, which I'm open to that issue.
Yeah. So I think we have 4 things we have to settle on as a group. The cap, the length of time that will be considered. We've settled on the operating costs and the no date. So I think we've settled on some of those, but I think we still have the length of time and the cap as active conversations here. And I think we've pretty much settled everything else except for brownfields, which need to come back to the general.
Okay, thank you, Tom, thank you, Commissioner, thank you, Chris. We're gonna switch gears and go to housing at this point.
Oh, we're not gonna just talk about the things in the bill that we need to change, like the brownfields.
I think we've already talked about it.
He hasn't been?
Oh, that's just to change the general fund.
Okay, David, we just have a change in the brownfields that have
Got that one, thank you.
are fabulous.
David Hall, Legislative Council. I also want to say I chatted with Cassie this morning about the Forgivable Loan Program, and understand that the $100,000 cap on the owner compensation comes into play when we're talking about how many months of operating expenses. That's where the limit hits. So I think I misspoke on the record on that point, and I wanted to correct it. Anyway, happy to talk about housing now if you wish.
Okay, let's see if we,
Thank you.
given that you raised it, I want to understand.
Well, darn it, sorry.
So does that affect the $100,000 on employer compensation? Does that affect the amount of the grant or entry into the program?
Yeah,
Both.
it's the latter. So they want to use the actual compensation paid in the base year and in the COVID years, so they get the full picture of what the business's reduction was. So if you paid 500 in base, but then you drop down to 250 and 250 in those subsequent 2 years, that all goes into the calculation of figuring out what your net operating income is, whether you hit the 25% target if you're in the program. They'll use the actual figures. The reduction comes on the loan side, and they're only going to allow up to $100,000 in total owner compensation to be an eligible expense when figuring, among the 3 caps on the program on the loan amount, your 3 months or your 6 months of operating expenses, that can only include up to $100,000 of owner compensation. So that's where the limit comes in.
Say that one again.
Okay.
So it sounds like it's for both.
No, I want to be sure because that's what I thought. And so again, when we're talking about net operating income adjustment, we have our revenues, we have our expenses across the base year and then 2020, 21. And they want to use the actual figures without adjustment for owner compensation, so they can compare owner compensation in 2019 versus what it actually was in 2021. So when we're calculating what the reduction in income was, we want to use the real dollars. We want to see that the owner compensation is
Right.
part of the model for figuring out
Right.
if you had an actual loss and if you hit the 25% reduction threshold.
Right.
So we're not adjusting owner's compensation on the calculation side. If you're in the program at that point, you're going to get a loan, but that loan is capped, and it's the lesser of the three things, right? The actual dollar figure for the program, whatever you designate, specify that to be, the amount of your reduction, or the 3 months/6 months of operating expenses. And so it's that last one, the 3 months or the 6 months, whichever you choose. It's the months of operating expenses. When we're spitting out what that value is, owner's compensation can only be $100,000 of that value, not more. So if the loss was, $1 million, that's one number. The 250 program cap is the second number. The third number is 6 times operating expenses, but only including $100,000 max of owner compensation.
So I understand the last thing, but you also said one of the caps is the limitation on the loss of income. Is owner compensation included in that as well?
It is. So that could be, that could be a higher number potentially if, for instance, you earned $500,000 in 2019, you paid yourself because you're a high-powered accountant or lawyer, and then you had to slash your compensation in 20 and 21. That would show up as a reduction in your operating income, and that reduction is one of the 3 limitors of your loan amount. But if that's a really high number, you're probably going to hit one of the other caps, right? Either the program limit or the 6 months of operating income, which can only include $100,000 of compensation.
Okay,
So an individual could have multiple sources of income outside of the business that's being examined. And so he could earn $1 million or $2 million in a year, but you're only looking at $100,000 from that business for something that's being calculated.
Right. It's a fair point, and in those situations, that's a good question for Vita. Who is the applicant? Is it that person, or is it one of their businesses? And if it's one of their businesses, how is it set up? And is it a pass-through? And do you count their other income or not? I don't know the answer.
And that's the plus of Vita looking at it, quite frankly.
Probably.
They will look at all that.
Well, they will look at it, but the question is, how have we given them any guidance as to how they will evaluate it?
I think our intent is clear.
Wasn't going to ask the question.
Yeah.
okay,
Anyway.
we're not going to resolve it. So let's move on to the housing.
Sure. So you want to talk about the S226 amendment that adds the Vermont Rental Housing Investment Program?
Yeah, explain I tried to explain it to the committee. I think there's a problem in setting up a change in a law that's contingent on another law passing. You raised that at some point as well. So 210, which we reference in 226, could not pass, and 226 could pass, and it would not amend anything. And we're trying to, so if 226 passes, we want the whole program to pass, not just the amendment. So, and as I said before, I asked you to strike it all. It was in the original version that way, just in the hope of saving some paper. I think it's we're setting ourselves up for the same problem we did last year with a budget bill having a certain amount of money and a program in another bill that was vetoed. And so we want to keep that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way that 210 is set up right now is that if 210 successfully passes and the rental housing investment program is in fact created in law and funded through S210, then that program, as enacted in S210, would be amended by S226 if it passes. If S226 does pass, but S210 does not, nothing happens in S226 with respect to that particular program because it refers to amending the bill as enacted. So if it's never enacted, it can't be amended. And the consequence is you do not have a Vermont Rental Housing Investment Program, and you do not have $20 million for it. It's not the only thing that's missing either from S226. You also don't have the revolving loan fund program. You don't have the rental housing health and safety program, nor the funding for the positions that it requires for DHCD and for DPS.
Well, we had those in the bill at one point, not all of them, it just didn't have the VHIP program. They had the entire S79 in 226, as I recall. I mean, that's where it was saved.
Originally, and remember that the rental housing provisions as constituted in S210 are not the same as in S79.
They're different. So, question, Mr. Chair. I thought we were not allowed to vote on the same thing twice in a session. So, I mean, we've already voted this language. Are we able to vote on it again?
It might be an issue if somebody raises it. It's a point of order. You know, somebody wants to kill the VHIP program and give it less chance of going forward, they could raise that.
You could also vote to override that objection.
We could. I know I think that's
I
out of it.
thought that was a problem. We might tweak it somewhat, but I don't see.
I don't think anyone wants to kill VHIP. As far as I can tell, everybody loves VHIP.
So we have a choice in the amendment you drafted for me. You just replicated the VHIP program. You didn't replicate the revolving loan fund.
That's right.
Or the rental housing.
The revolving loan fund is interesting because I think there's $1 million still sitting
It's
there,
still sitting at ACCD.
but they don't have a
But there's no
program.
program.
There's no program.
They need the program, exactly. They need the language, just like VHIP does.
But-
And VHIP needs the extra money.
All right, well, that's, I view this as a technical fix. I don't know whether I think we do. I mean, we don't know how good the VHIP program is because we've never run it, but we, at one point, have funded it and supported it.
Yeah, we supported the pilot.
That's very similar in some ways to the ADUs we're trying to get here, you know, letting homeowners fix their homes with the revolving loan fund. So at the very least, we want to have those two. And I don't know if it's necessary to have noodle that after touch base with David. Okay. Let's